Thanks to the Sarah, our mother group of week 4 for, I think, searching and rich conversation, some really good engagement with the text of Romans, some of the commentaries. I just want to devote a few minutes here to responding to what you all have contributed to this discussion. And I think I want to begin by bringing together Brian and Tradquil's responses. Tradquil, thanks for a video, by the way. It was nice to hear your voice and see you on the screen after a few weeks of mostly just writing to each other. But Brian, you say, emphasizing that Abraham is our father, and therefore we enjoy and cultivate and spread the inheritance that was promised to him and his family by faith rather than according to the flesh. And this is one of the themes of Tradquil's response as well. And so I think I just want to emphasize this and maybe unpack it a little bit more because we tend to think about this contrast between faith and flesh in terms that are perhaps a little too simple or too familiar to some of the divides or debates of our time. Remember that when Paul has been talking about what descendants according to the flesh might involve, which he is opposing, he has talked especially about circumcision and circumcision as a work of the law. And that is the illustrative case of what descendants and inheritance according to the flesh would be about. And that is not something that is strictly limited, shall we say, to what we think of as biological relation. Abraham circumcised not only Isaac, but as the generations wear on, all of the males that are not just born into the household, but also adopted from other peoples are circumcised. So that the key with circumcision as an illustrative case of descendants or relation according to the flesh is how it involves a mark on the body. And by extension, the way that obedience to the law can be construed as a kind of appearance and a way of governing relationships that is captive to whether or not appearances are adequate. That, I think, is what Paul is getting at when he talks about inheritance according to the flesh. And this jives quite well, I think, with Tradquil, a really great reflection of yours, because you're talking about various ways in which people's bodies are interpreted in our day so as to group them and pit them against one another, to boast, as you say, in the power or the supposed promise of certain bodily appearances. Race, I think, is a key one, obviously, in our time, where the way people's bodies are interpreted racially affects the distribution of power. And the way that our system geopolitically of nations interacts with that is another significant dimension of that kind of measuring people according to the flesh, according to whether or not their, the prevalent interpretation of their body delivers the kind of ruling power that our existing game of power seeks and wants. And as you say eloquently, Tradquil, we're called, I think, to oppose that game according to the flesh, and instead to live our lives by faith, which is what empowers us to embrace bodies and bodily relationships that don't count as impressive or promising, and also to see our own bodies caught up in that life-giving work of God in the world. So that was a great word. And I think that that helps us to hone in on one of Paul's really key points in the section that we studied, especially chapter 4 for this past week. Also, Tradquil, I really liked how you started your video response, talking about how this passage has helped you to rethink faith so that it doesn't function as a social status, as it so often does in many contexts in the world today, including ours in the US. And what's key there, I think, is that faith itself is, what shall we say? It's rather austere. Everyone's life is complicated, and it's not really possible to totalize someone's life according to one definition. And yet the way that we have interpreted faith in many contexts allows faith to be kind of the surface way of totalizing someone's life, so that what people supposedly fundamentally are is people of faith, Christian people, even if what is determining the shape of their life are habits of capitalist living, or the life of sort of white suburbia, or any number of configurations of life that kind of grouped under the umbrella of faith, even if we can't really say that those kinds of living are some kind of straightforward expression of what faith is. And so that's why it's important, I think, to be describing faith in a way that does not excuse injustice, but nor does it act to sort of define who is right in some sort of total sense. But as we see with Abraham, it is a kind of desperate clinging to God in light of who we are not, in light of what we do not have, and what we long to become by God's power. And you make a great case, I think, Tradquil, for how righteousness or justice in the world comes by the gift of God that human beings do not control, and that we can therefore not take credit for and use as a political weapon to subordinate others who supposedly don't conform to our plans for righteousness or justice or thriving or prosperity in the world. Thanks for some great contributions, Brian and Tradquil. Rod, your contribution here, I think, fits nicely into this train of thought, because you, I thought, restated very well how important it is to avoid conceiving of justification within a kind of framework of work and wage. Justification is not the reward for something that human beings do that's called faith. That would undermine the very point that Paul is making in contrasting justification by faith with justification by works of the law or other works as well. Instead, justification, I think, to understand it as Paul presents it here, must be understood as a gift, as something that human beings have not earned, that is not their wage, that is not a condition that they have met and should therefore impose on others and use as a measuring stick for their life and the lives of others. Faith is instead a gift of God, which, plumbing a little deeper into Romans, is really the life of Christ himself at work in us. And it is transformative. It is, you might say, necessary for the full healing of the human, but it is a gift of God rather than a reward for something that human beings can claim to have done. And that's going to affect how we make sense of faith, how we talk about it at work among us, how we think of people who do not have faith in the way that we understand faith to be. So lots of implications there that we'll be pursuing further along this line in Romans. Winston, I love what you brought up about the way that Paul is telling a story here that subverts some of the predominant stories or myths that shape us socially and individually, psychologically today. I think you mentioned some of the kind of myths of the American dream and how unlike that sort of story, this story of Abraham is. And therefore, why I think we need to be formed by this kind of story from Romans, so that we can engage critically the mythologies that we have inherited and that are so powerful to shape the social fabric and the psychology of all of us today. So that was a great word, and I hope you'll keep thinking about that. In another group this week, someone actually brought up the same thing about Taiwanese national myths. This is a Taiwanese student, and she was just struck by how different the story of Israel, especially through the life of Abraham and Jesus in this section, is to some of the stories of Taiwan that are powerful for shaping the distribution of power and kind of the social fabric in Taiwanese society. So that was a good connection there. Priscilla, love what you've underscored in your post, the tendency in your context, which I think is common to mine as well, and probably reflects the influence of Protestant missionaries in the past in your context, and how that shaped the Christian tradition there. And that's where we have some common roots in some ways, even as we're living in very different contexts today. But that is, the need to recover the sense in which the law is a gift and not a burden to be replaced by the gospel. There's so much to draw from that insight, I think, because to think that we can understand God's calling on our life apart from the law is really to be missing one of the key ways that God has revealed God's self and called to us. In our time, I think we desperately need sound interpretation of the law to engage some of the social and ecological crises that we've inherited. So there's just a lot to be said about the importance of the law and Paul's way of vindicating the law, even as he exposes its limits and warns against its misuse, but nevertheless vindicates it as a witness to God's grace that reaches its fullness in Christ. So that's another just sensibility that I hope we'll continue to cultivate and spread in our teaching and our living. And you ask at the end of your post, Priscilla, about Eliot's kind of foregrounding of empire. This kind of resonates a little bit with what I was saying in response to Tradcool's reflections, but I agree with you that Eliot tends perhaps to foreground the anti-imperial edge of Paul's teaching a little much, in a way that I think doesn't always work very well with how the text develops. So there, I agree with you. And yet, in light of somehow I was unpacking this according to the flesh concept earlier, I think that there is indeed an anti-imperial implication in Paul's argument, already present in the law, developed though in Paul's gospel. And we will want in our day, I think, to bring out these anti-imperial implications of Paul's teaching so that we can engage some of the dominating influences politically, economically, etc., in our contexts with the power of the gospel, but hopefully not in a way that dilutes or sets aside the most direct and particular concerns of Paul's writing. And that's what will lead us, I think, to see that Paul is focused especially on the dynamics and quality of our lives together in Christian community and in our local relationships among neighbors. That is in some ways the primary front of resistance to empire, even if it's not as sexy as some of the things that we associate with resisting empire today. But for Paul, the way that we combat the ruling power of sin that Christ has freed us from is manifest, especially in our bodily relations with our neighbors, not least in our local Christian communities. If we lose sight of that, then I think that the way that we speak against empire or organize against empire will often lack power. So that's a good word. And then finally, Jamie, I love the phrase that you drew, I think also from Eliot, about Abraham and Paul, especially as a verbal progenitor. And one of the things that this gets to that is so important for us because of some of the obsessions of our context is that the way that you shape an intergenerational family of people or community of people over time can hardly be reduced merely to procreation. I don't think anybody in Paul's day was that naive. And today we sometimes have this idea that this is what holds communities together over time, is some myth about their biological purity or relations. And that's just not true. Any of us who are parents or grandparents and beyond know that you can't actually control very well the children that you give birth to. There's so much more that goes into the shape of their lives than their genetic inheritance from their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. And Paul is well acquainted with that, as was Abraham. And so the law is not concerned with, simply dictating some kind of biological course of a community's life over generations. It's concerned with memory, hope, and especially practices that will shape a community's life, both those who are born into it, but also those who are adopted into it in a whole variety of ways. And it's the power of practice that Paul is engaging here. And he is concerned about the wrong kind of emphasis on practice, where the impressive appearance of bodies that are supposedly obedient to the prescribed practices becomes the measure by which power is distributed. And that's not inheritance according to faith. The practices that faith promotes are kind of hospitality, self-giving, investment in what does not appear impressive, what does not measure up, practices that don't seem to be entirely obedient. These are the theater, you might say, where faith is expressed. So anyway, Jamie, this just gets at the idea that what is a generative influence, what acts as a progenitor, is not just a sexual union and procreation. It is the way we speak, the way we use words, how we tell stories, the way we care for each other or fail to care for each other. This is the way that communities are shaped over generations. And Paul is teaching the communities in Rome and us to learn the ways that God holds people together and causes them to flourish even against what appears to be powerful. All right. Thanks again to all of you for some really good contributions. I enjoyed reading your responses and appreciate your earnest engagement with one another and with the material of the course. Looking forward to week 5.